Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about estimating dates and places in your family tree and how to use this methodology as a research tool. Now, some of you may have been doing family history for a long time and this may be old hat information. If you've got other ideas about how you use this process, I and others would love to hear about them in the comments here on the YouTube video. If you're brand new to family history, this might be a new concept to you and it might seem a little bit overwhelming at first. But stick with us, and if you have questions, again, leave them as comments here on the YouTube channel and I will answer those as I can. Now, let's go ahead and dive in. The first thing I want to talk about is why we might consider estimating dates and places. What benefit is it to do that? The first one is, if you enter that information into your family tree, it's going to help with the hints and the searches from tree. Sometimes when all you have is a name, that's great, especially if you know that that name is accurate. But if you can estimate a date or a place or throw it in there into your tree and see what happens, that can be useful. You might generate some hints that you can review and see if they make sense. Now remember, hints are just possibilities. They are not necessarily records for your ancestor, but seeing what kind of hints are generated by throwing in an approximate date or place is a useful research methodology. It also helps when you're doing searches from your tree. If you have no dates or places, if all you're searching for is a name, sometimes the amount of data that comes back can be overwhelming. But if, for example, you know this person's never left the United States, even just giving it a birth location of United States can help narrow down your search results so that you can have a more reasonable group of search results to work with. If you know, for example, that a person's child was born in 1850, you're not going to be looking for birth records for the parent in the 1750s. So again, estimating can help you kind of narrow down your pool of search results. Another thing that estimating dates and places does is it helps you to identify holes and discrepancies in your research process. Especially for those of us when we're brand new, it's really easy to just copy information, or maybe we inherited, like I did, a whole bunch of information from other family members. And going through and doing kind of a logic check on some of those dates and places helps you to find some of the holes and discrepancies. It helps you to make sense of some of the information and discover where some of the information may have gone wrong. It also helps you to create timelines, and timelines are a thing that I love, that'll lead you to additional record sources. Anytime you have a timeline of events in a person's life and can start to plug in possible or estimated dates and places, it helps lead you to what other records might have existed in that time and place that can give you additional information about this person and their family. Now, there are other reasons why we use this technique, but that's all we're going to talk about today. So if you've got other ideas for ways that this has helped you, again, would love to hear about those in the YouTube comments. So let's start with births. These are just some general guidelines or guiding principles for how I estimate birth information in my own family tree. The first thing is you can typically guesstimate that parents' birth dates are between 18 and 45 years older than their children. Now, of course, there are going to be exceptions to this rule. You will sometimes have 14, 15, 16-year-old mothers. You will sometimes have 70, 80, 90-year-old fathers. That is possible, but typically they're going to fall within a standard range, and that gives you a place to start looking. It's kind of that idea of you start with the simplest solution first, and if that doesn't pan out, then you can expand your search parameters. But this is just a really good guideline to kind of help you guesstimate. Now, one of the reasons why that year span is so broad is because oftentimes when we've identified, say, our great-grandfather, if we're looking for information about his parents, we might think, oh, well, I'm going to look 20, 25 years older than him for two individuals who could be his parents. What if he's the youngest in the family of 10 or 12 children, though? Now you've got a broader distance between him and the birth year of his parents. So keep some of those things in mind as you're going through this process. Another way to calculate birth information is to do it from the records that you have. One of the things we need to be aware of, especially when we use census records, is that the information on the census is only as good as the person who was the informant and the person who was writing down that information, or the census enumerator. First of all, the informant was not necessarily the person whose information is there. So every person didn't have to personally report on their information. It could have been the woman of the household, it could have been the man of the house, it could have been the 13-year-old child in the house, it could have been the next door neighbor who, happened to know some things about the family and may have gotten their ages totally wrong. But at least it gives you an idea. And if you can find multiple censuses, you can start to create a consensus or look for patterns about how that person's age is reported. Now, you never want to enter that into your database, however, as a birth year. You always want to make sure that it's understood, that it's estimated or calculated based on information from records. Prior to 1850 in the United States, the 1790 through the 1840 U.S. federal censuses, it only gave an age range with little tick marks and no names. And so if you can figure out who in the family belongs to each of those tick marks, you then only have a range, not even an exact year, but you can still put that information in there. Sometimes we see lists of children, for example, in a parent's will or in an obituary. And very often those children are listed in birth order. Sometimes they're listed sons and then daughters, or daughters and then sons, but typically in many records they're listed in birth order, but no ages are given. And so one of the things you can do at that point is you can guesstimate, again, that children in the ages prior to birth control typically were spaced between 1 and 2 years apart. And so you can start estimating birth years based on birth order if you have a list of children. Again, the purpose of this is to lead you to additional records. It's not to stand as the final data that you're entering into your tree. Another way to estimate birthplaces has to do with where the family lives. If a family lives in the same place from one census to the next, chances are the children born in between those two census years were born in that location. Now, are there exceptions to this and every rule? Of course. I have families in my own family history. Many of you have heard me talk about Carroll County, Arkansas, and they show up census after census after census in Carroll County, Arkansas. But as I have dug into additional records, looking for birth records and marriage records, one of the things that I've discovered is that sometimes they go up into Missouri, in between census years to work, or over into Oklahoma to work, and end up coming back home to Carroll County, but they have been away in ensuing years. As a matter of fact, I was just joking with my father about this weekend. I was actually born here in Utah County, which is where the Ancestry headquarters are, but I was not raised here. We moved away when I was about 1.5 years or 2 years old, back to Los Angeles, which is where both of my parents were born and raised. All of my brothers and sisters were born in California. I was raised in California and Oregon. I went to school in Idaho and Oregon, and just came back to Utah in my 20s as an adult. And so if I die here, it's possible if somebody was looking at a record for me, it would look like I was born and died in the same place. And the assumption might be, without further research, that I never went anywhere. When in reality, I have not only traveled to a lot of places, but I have lived not just on the West Coast, but on the East Coast as well. So that idea that just because you find families in a census, again, you start with the simplest explanation, which is they never left, look for records, but then sometimes you have to branch out and look for additional records. Let's talk about marriages. So marriages are easier to estimate if you have identified all of the children in a particular family. Now, typically what that means is that you're going to look for a marriage record within 1 to 2 years prior to the birth of the first child. Again, not a hard and fast rule. We're talking about estimating to help us progress our research. And so, that first child or two may actually end up being the children of a wife from the previous marriage, or the children of the wives from her previous marriage who just happened to be using their stepfather's surname. It could be that the couple actually didn't get married until after the first child or two was born. I've seen all of those scenarios. However, typically, this is going to be the rule. And so you can start with your research within a year or two of the birth of that first child. If parents and children are born in the same place, you can look for a marriage in that same place as well. If the parents and children are not born in the same place, or if the two parents were born in separate places and they aren't living there by the time you find them, look for a marriage record near where the oldest child was born. Now, this brings up something that might be a little bit new for some of you who are new to family history, and that is this idea of researching entire families. Oftentimes our family tree or family history is presented in a pedigree format, an individual, their two parents, their four grandparents, and so on. The challenge with that is that unless you go to a person's profile and start looking at the information about their family, we sometimes forget that we need to be adding brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and nieces and nephews, looking at an entire family in context. And this is just one of the reasons why we do that. Because if you know who all of the children in a family are, then you know where to look for records for those parents. Okay, so your ancestor may be one of their younger children or a middle child in some way, but getting all the children back to that oldest child is going to help give you further clues for where to look for a marriage record for those parents. And that marriage record may be just the piece of information you need to provide information about their ages and their birthplaces and sometimes even their parents' names. Okay, let's talk about death. So we've worked our way through the life cycle here, birth, marriage, and now death. Just a couple of things to look for as you come across records. If someone is listed as widowed on a census record, in a city directory, in newspaper articles, any number of places where that information might show up, look for the death of the spouse previous to that date. That seems like basic information, but sometimes we just don't clue in on that. However, be aware that sometimes people listed they were widowed when in fact they were divorced. Again, not the rule, that is the exception to the rule, but that does happen. As a matter of fact, I was just looking at a case last night where the man is listed as widowed in the census when in fact he and his wife divorced 5 years later, and so they just weren't living together in that particular census. But that just gives you some clues about where to look for information. Another place that we often can kind of narrow in on a death date is if you've got surviving family members. So somebody dies and they have an obituary that lists their surviving family members, or they have a will or their estate is probated. Look for anybody who is not mentioned to have died previous. Now, of course, this means that there has to be others mentioned. So, for example, if a man dies and it lists his wife and his children as surviving him, that's great. You can assume that they are all still living, but don't assume that his brothers and sisters are not. But if 3 of his brothers and sisters are listed and one of them isn't listed as a survivor, that's a clue that that one sibling likely died before this particular individual. So it's just a way to start looking out for information. So just because someone is not listed as a survivor doesn't mean they died before. But if all the other family members are listed and 1 or 2 are glaringly missing, that is a clue that they likely may have died before that individual. So you can start to estimate time and place based on that information. Another way is that if you're able to consistently find records for them throughout their life, they're in census after census, they're in city directories in between, and then all of a sudden they disappear, but other family members are still showing up in some of that same time and place, that's a good idea or a good clue that they may have died prior to when they disappeared. Now again, there are exceptions. So if somebody all of a sudden disappears and their whole family disappears, it's likely that they moved somewhere else, and you'll have to pick up the trail again. But again, start wrapping your head around this idea that some of those things might happen. Now, I've kind of given you a lot of cautions along the way. Let me give you a few more. If you're going to enter some of these estimated dates and places into a public family tree on Ancestry, be sure to enter some of your reasons into the description field. Now, if your tree is private, you can play around with it to your heart's content, do whatever you like. And nobody's going to be any the wiser. It's not going to affect anybody else. But if you want to play around with some of this, and I do, my tree is a working tree that I play around with all the time. It has conclusions in it and well-sourced, well-documented information, but it also has some stuff where I have estimated dates and places. So if you're going to enter that into a public tree, that's great. Just make sure you enter some information into the description field so anybody who comes across your tree will understand what it is that they're looking at. So let me just show you what that looks like. If I come here to William Bernard Sears, he is a great something grandfather in my family tree, and pull up his profile. It looks like he's my 5th great grandfather on my maternal line. And you can see here that his oldest child was born in, let me make this a little bigger for y'all, in 1770. So I've got an oldest child born in 1770, children born all the way through to 1794. His wife was born in 1750. Now, if I didn't know when he was born, it would be fairly safe to guesstimate that I'm looking for a birth sometime around 1748 or so. I've got an estimated marriage date here of 1769. Now that date is just estimated based on the birth of that oldest child. So in the description field, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to write marriage date and place estimated based on the birth year of the oldest child and the birthplaces of the oldest child and Elizabeth, his spouse. Okay, so now I've got a little description in there that will show up, and anybody who comes to see my tree will see that I've got an about, ABT, 1769. That's my clue to myself that this is an estimated date, and then I've got a description about how I came to that conclusion. Now, one of the other things that I've got here on William is I've got a birth year of 1732. Now, I inherited my family history information from researchers in my family who had been doing this for decades before I got involved. And I'm in the process of going through and validating all of this information. And so I don't know where this birth date came from. However, what I do know is that William Sears he served in the Revolutionary War. And I've looked at his Revolutionary War service information. And based on his rank and responsibility, it makes sense to me that he was maybe older than 20 or 25 at the time that he served in the Revolutionary War. And there are some clues in some family history lore and some papers that we've inherited that he was significantly older than his wife, that he didn't marry until later in life because he came over from England as an adult. And so I've got all of this family lore, which is a source. We've got some old family history information that is a source. And so it's up to me to either come in here and edit this information and put in a description that says this information came from family sources and hasn't yet been verified, or to actually go out and do the research and add source citations here that will help me document these dates and figure out exactly where that information came from. So that is just one example from my family tree. I do have a couple of others here. If we look at Asa Wade, you're going to see I've got a guesstimated birth year of about 1780. That actually comes from pre-1850 census records. I've been able to kind of narrow in on an approximate age. I could put in a range. Some people do that to give me a little bit of a broader set of years to work with. But the idea is based on census records and how his age is reported, I've been kind of able to narrow in on this approximate birth year. So I put about 1780. Now, I have documentation or paperwork that shows that some of his property was disposed of at a certain place in time. I have his wife showing up in a census record in 1850 as a widow, and he shows up in the 1840 census. So I have this idea that he died sometime between 1840, when he last shows up in a record, and 1850, when some of his property was disposed of and his wife shows up alone. And so I've just put in after 1840 as an approximate death year as I continue to look for additional evidence to determine that. Now, some of you may choose to leave those fields blank if you can't come up with a specific date, and that's fine. But one of the things that I've learned is that the further you go back in history, the less likely you are to have a precise answer. And so one of the things we do with the genealogical proof standard is we collect all the evidence, and sometimes that evidence is not direct, meaning sometimes there's no record anywhere that says this person was born on this date or this person died on this date. You can only narrow it down to an approximate time based on the evidence that you're collecting. And so in where I'm at in my research right now with Asa Wade, that is as good as it gets for me. And so that's how I choose to represent that in my tree. So feel free to use some of those date ranges or qualifiers. Some of the ones that are acceptable in online ancestry trees are about, ABT, before, which is BEF, or after, which is AFT. And that will help you and others who might be able to see your tree to avoid some confusion. It's better than just putting in a specific date if you don't have evidence to support that specific date. Last set of cautions for you has to do with checking existing information on your tree. So again, all of us were new at one point. In my case, my newness meant that I inherited a bunch of stuff and just imported it all into the same tree and started working from there. Some of you just showed up on Ancestry a week or two ago and are still in your free trial period, and you're so excited about those leaf hints and the research that other people have done, and I think that that's fantastic. But one of the cautions you have to take is that as you're copying information from other people's trees, do a little bit of a gut check. Make sure that the information that you're adding makes sense. And so here are just some of those make sense things. Spouses in first marriages usually are between 16 and 30 years old. Are there exceptions? Yes, but that is a general rule of thumb. And they're usually within 10 years of age of one another. So if you've got something in your tree where the dates are wildly off or the ages are wildly off, what you might be looking at is somebody has copied information incorrectly. I've seen situations where a father and a son have the same name, for example, and the son ends up married to his mother. Somebody has copied the wrong spouse. And so now you've got this woman who is 30 years older than her husband, when in fact she's just been attached to her son as a spouse instead of to his father as the spouse, because those two men have the same name. Little things like that are easy mistakes to make, and I totally understand how that happens, but going through your tree with this kind of an eye to do this kind of a gut check will help you discover some of those things. Women typically give birth between ages 15 and 45. I have seen a few younger and a few older, but that's a general rule of thumb. So if you've got a woman with children who are born outside of that range, you either have her identity wrong, you have her birth date wrong, or you have the birth date of one of those children wrong. So it's something to look out for. Full siblings are usually no more than 20 to 25 years apart in age. So a woman is typically not having children for more than 20 to 25 years, and so you've got this range of children. If you have a range of children that fall outside of that, you might want to consider that the father of that family may have been married previously, and some of those older children or some of those younger children might belong to a different spouse. And so that's something to look at. And then, this seems silly, but I have seen it, women are typically not having children after they're dead. So again, just do some gut checks on some of those dates that you have in your tree, and if the information's correct or incorrect, consider deleting that person altogether, because you may have grabbed the wrong person altogether, or at the very least delete some of those dates until you can find some additional evidence in genealogical records outside of family trees that will help lead you to the correct information. Now, I say women can't have children after they're dead, but keep in mind that men can. So many wife has been pregnant when her husband was killed, and so has had a baby, 6, 8, even 9 months after his death. And of course, in today's world, with some of the technology we have, we might see that pop up more and more. But back in history, certainly not more than 9 months after the husband dies. I have seen records 2 years, 3 years after the husband died, where the mother lists her deceased husband as the parent of that child, but not possible. So keep that in mind. Keep lots of other just common sense things in mind. Super easy to make mistakes, super easy to fall into the trap of, putting a date in and then discovering new information and not going back and adjusting the date. I have been guilty of that. So hopefully this was useful information for you. just to give you some ideas about how to estimate dates for the purpose of furthering your research, and how to check the dates you already have in your tree for the purpose of making sure that you've got solid information in there, for making sure that the people you're entering into your tree are your family and not someone else's, because we all want to make sure we're climbing our own family tree and not somebody else's, or making up people to put into our tree. That's all I have for you today. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.